A recent headline in the Financial Times read, "Scientists create synthetic life with a computer and 4 bottles of chemicals." The Wall Street Journal announced, quote, "Scientists create synthetic organism." And the organist, or the economist in London wrote, "And what man-made life, the first artificial organism and its consequences." Well, what they were reporting on was the accomplishment of a group of scientists who used a computer program and 4 chemicals to create DNA. Then they injected the DNA into a cell, at which point that cell began to reproduce itself. One British writer was so impressed by this accomplishment that he wrote, quote, "This is a complete victory for materialism," noting that atheists would point to the announcement as the evidence that there is no need for a divine creator. But is that true? What constitutes life? Was life really created? What do we learn from this accomplishment? And what questions are still to be answered? Where is all of this leading? And should we, as a society, be venturing down this path of trying to create synthetic organisms? These are very important and very relevant questions that we'll be looking for answers for on tonight's program. Good evening, everyone. I'm Steve Van Horn. Welcome to Answers for a Thirsty World. Not too long ago, a group of scientists, as I mentioned, created DNA in a lab using a computer and 4 chemicals. Then they took the DNA out of an existing cell and injected the newly created synthetic DNA into that cell, and that cell began to grow and multiply. Some reporters called this accomplishment the creation of life, but the New York Times only said synthetic DNA took over a cell. So what happened? Was life created or not? If it was, then what does that imply about God? But perhaps more important questions to be asked are, what are the possibilities of this discovery? And should we even be going down this scientific path? Well, to help us understand what's going on and the implications and to help us answer these questions is our guest tonight, Barret, who's a medical doctor, but he has training in molecular biology. Barret, welcome to the program.
Thank you, Steve.
Welcome back to the program, I should say. You were here
you.
a couple of months ago.
Yes.
Just want to let you know that on tonight's program, we'll be opening up phone lines in a couple of minutes. And when we do that, that will be your opportunity to call and be a part of the program. We're going to try to keep this simple. It's a very relevant question that we're talking about tonight. The scientists created this DNA, put it into a cell. The cells seem to come alive, or that's what they're claiming. And just what are the implications of that? So if you have questions tonight or comments about exactly what constitutes life, whether this was life being created or just something else, something lesser, and what the implications might be, whether it be religious implications or even scientific implications, we will invite you to call and be a part of the program, and that'll be just in a few minutes. So, Barret, as we begin down this path tonight, this is potentially a pretty deep subject.
Yes.
But we're going to work real hard at keeping it very simple.
Okay.
And just what I want to do to begin with is to just begin looking just one step at a time, explaining very clearly what these steps were. The lead scientist was Craig Ventner.
Yes.
Tell us a little bit about this, Craig Ventner.
Well, Craig Ventner has made headlines in the past. Well known, probably one of the leading scientists with respect to his work on genetic engineering. Was very significant part of the Human Genome Project, and is very well known, not only by science but also by the media.
Now you used a term, and you gave me some articles like genome.
Yes.
How is that similar or different to just DNA that we're going to be talking about?
Well, genome is basically all the genes, so all the DNA that's incorporated in a cell.
Okay. So for us simple-minded people, if we talk about genomes, we think of it as DNA. It's not exactly
Correct.
the same, but it's probably close enough.
Correct.
Okay. So let's take step by step exactly what these scientists did, being led by Ventnor. The first step was what? The
first step is actually the most important. And the first step is actually synthesizing or making the DNA. Now, this is different than simply copying DNA, which has been done for decades. And very commonly, we're able to put DNA into a cell and make many copies of it, and then the proteins that are made from that DNA use. And in fact, Genentech and insulin, which was done in the 70s, is an example of that. But that's a copy of DNA. In this instance, what actually Ventnor did, and this is where the issue comes in with the chemicals in the computer program, is that he took each part of DNA and put it together, and so he made the DNA rather than simply copying it from something.
So how does the computer come into play here?
Okay. The computer comes into play because what he did is that he sequenced DNA from a known type of bacteria. And so he took that sequence, and so he knew what the map was. He knew what the words on the page were, and so then he went and took the individual chemicals, and then he used some tricks and some techniques using yeast and other kinds of things to splice those chemicals together to make DNA. Now, at this point, the largest synthetic DNA that's ever been made is about 500,000 base pairs.
What does that mean?
So a base pair is basically a letter, and the combination of three letters codes for an amino acid, which makes a protein. And that's the basis of all molecular biology.
And what's the significance of making a protein?
Well, protein are really the things that control the function of a cell. So DNA basically tells you what amino acids are put together to make what kinds of proteins. Depending on the sequence of the amino acids in the protein depends on its structure and its function, and so forth. So what Ventnor did was he was able to put together, in this case, 1 million base pairs in order to make the genome of this bacteria.
And what was the other, you said before this, how many
Before
pairs?
this, really the most that anybody had made was 500,000.
And he doubled that.
And he doubled that.
So basically, I don't want to say he complicated it, because that's not the right thing, but he just really made a much more complex.
He made a longer piece of DNA.
Yeah, right. Now, for those who may have heard the term, and I'll have to put me in that category, is we hear DNA, and sometimes I hear that and I have to go back and look at the definition again. Mm-hmm. So again, what exactly is DNA, and again, why is that so important?
Well, DNA is the abbreviation for deoxyribonucleic acid. And basically, this acid is the double helix, and there are bases that point inside of these, and the pairing of these bases is able to be read by enzymes and other kinds of molecules to make proteins.
Okay, now that's, again, a lot of scientific terms there. As far as I think sometimes we hear crime investigations, and they say that
Correct.
the person out here, the alleged crime guy, the villain, bad guy,
The bad guy.
that there was a DNA matchup.
Correct.
So what are they looking for? Again, I'm trying to look for just a real practical application or description. When we're talking about, and it says his DNA.
Yes.
What does that mean?
Well, his DNA is what's inside the nucleus of every cell. So DNA is really what makes you genetically.
Now that you mean even like color of eyes,
Color of eyes,
skin,
color of
hair,
eyes,
you know,
hairs,
this whole
all
thing.
of those things
Okay.
are related to your DNA. And every cell in your body has the same type of DNA.
Okay.
Now, you and I vary in the kinds of DNA that we have. So if I find some hair or some other type of biological tissue, I can extract that DNA, and then using something called PCR, which basically makes many, many, many copies of that DNA, I can get enough of it to match with other DNA, and that's how the matching is done.
Okay, so basically, each cell in our body has the same DNA in it. And another thing we're going to talk about is how this this accomplishment, that the thing that Ventnor did, is that cell that he put the DNA to started self-replicating. And so that's why each cell in our body, as it grows and multiplies and replicates, that it spreads the DNA throughout the entire body. Am I?
That's correct.
Okay. Well, that's enough technical stuff, and hang in there with us. We're gonna move down this path, but we're gonna get real practical real soon. So if you're out there scratching your head, just hang in there for another minute. So then, what did he do? He created this DNA, which is the characteristic, kind of the genetic information that we have in our bodies.
He created
that with 4 chemicals. You know, a computer program. Then what did he do? What was the next step?
Well, what he did is that he understood what the genome of this bacteria looked like. So he was trying to make a copy of that, but he did it synthetically. Mm-hmm. And interestingly enough is that at one point he made a mistake. So he messed up on just one base pair, and the process didn't work.
Okay.
So the necessity to have the exact copy of the essential part of the DNA to make the cell function is a very important thing to understand and to recognize in this process. And what he did is that he actually modified the DNA somewhat. He knocked out 14 genes that could have made this a dangerous bacteria, pathogenic bacteria. Mm-hmm. So he knocked out 14 genes that did that. And then he actually added some DNA that basically put his signature into the DNA. Mm-hmm. And he did, if you could decode it, you could find the names of 46 researchers that were involved, and as well as quotes from various authors.
Yeah, I won't take that. So,
but that actually becomes important as we talk about what he did.
Okay. So he took, to try and simplify it, he took a cell, an already existing cell.
Yes.
He extracted the DNA from it.
Correct.
And then he injected this synthetic DNA into it.
That's correct.
Okay, and then what happened?
Okay, now one of the things that's important is it wasn't the same species. So it was a different type of bacteria.
Okay.
They were both Mycoplasma bacteria, but it was a different strain of bacteria. So he had to fool the cell.
Bacteria is not always bad. Sometimes I think of bacteria
That's
and I
true.
think of getting sick, but we're just talking about a general term here.
Exactly.
Okay.
A very simple life form.
Okay.
A technical term, a prokaryote. So they don't have a nucleus. It's different, and so it's a simple way to do it. And he doesn't have some of the complications in a more complex life form that he has to deal with.
So that was you. I want to go back to what you said because I think it is significant in this. You said it was a different species.
Yes.
Okay. And I think that's significant because in this whole scientific discussion, if it was the same species, then that could imply some different things. Okay.
Right.
So go
but
ahead.
This was not a copy of DNA.
Yeah.
He made the DNA.
Right.
It's synthetic. He put it in the cell. He tricked it in some ways. He chemically modified the DNA to get it started.
Right.
And then the DNA started working, started making proteins, and the cell replicated.
Which is what our bodies do.
Correct.
Okay. So that it started doing everything that your cells and my cells do, but it had a synthetic
This
DNA.
is the first cell that DNA did not come from another cell.
How's this, just so we understand, what's the difference between this and cloning?
Well, cloning, again, let's take the analogy of a book. What's more difficult to do? To take a 500-page book and make a copy of it, or to write out all the pages of that book? Well, obviously, it's easier to copy it.
Right.
Cloning is simply copying. And so cloning is basically taking known DNA, not synthesizing, not changing, not doing anything, and putting it in a different type of cell.
Okay.
And there's some complications as to why cloning is technically problematic as well, but they're different than this. Okay. In this case, he didn't take a copy of the DNA, he made the DNA in laboratory.
Okay, so there is that difference. I think we'll go ahead and put the phone up on the screen now, and if you have questions about this, if you have, as we go along, if you have comments about the creation of life and whether man can create life, whether you even think it's possible that man can create life, whether this was that or not, we're going to talk about that in a minute, or just the implications of what Ventnor did, and Ventnor and his team. So as we go through this, the implications about God, about life, about creation, about evolution. So if you have any of those kind of questions or comments, we'd invite you to call. Let's talk about the issue of creation of life. I don't think there's anybody that would question the fact that this is a major accomplishment in the scientific realm. But in your view, was this creating life, or was it simply playing around with it a little bit?
Well, what he created was not life, but a new species. So your definition of life and the way that the term life has been used in the media around this event, I think, is very significant. What really he did was synthesize a strand of DNA, put it into a cell, and created a new type of bacteria. One of the significant implications are, what is that bacteria going to do?
Yeah, and we'll get into that in a little bit. I heard somebody say that I heard a comment on this, that they said really what he was doing was manipulating DNA, that he was not creating life. Is that how you would explain it?
I think that's how I would explain it. And I think, interestingly enough, Nature is one of the leading scientific publications, and when this came out in Nature...
That's a magazine?
Yes. They asked 8 experts to comment on it. And I think that a decade ago, people would have had a very different response than they had today. I think a decade ago, people would say it had significantly more philosophical implications than it did today. Interestingly, only 1 out of these 8 people who commented on it really thought that it really had anything to do with issues of a divine creator or materialism. So I think that the scientific response has been guarded and extremely well informed, and I think it produces a balanced view that is much better than probably we would have seen 10 years ago.
Why do you think the media, some of the media, just immediately jumped out and made these claims? Life has been created, this is a victory for materialists, etc., etc. Is that an overreach? Is there an agenda there, do you think?
Well, I think it creates good press, good copy. And those things, anything that's provocative is something that the media is going to gravitate towards. And they did get some people, such as Arthur Caplan, to come out and say this is the end of vitalism, and life is nothing more than information and chemistry and physics. And I think with that response, that's why some of the media, did what it did. Also, Ventnor's well known, for his fascination and his relationship with the media, and Ventnor himself, adds to some of the spin that goes along with this.
So this is, I think what we'll do right now, I just think about this. If you're just tuning in and you're wondering what it is that we're talking about, the question that we're asking tonight is, can man create life? And there's been a scientist and his team that has created a synthetic DNA using 4 chemicals and a computer program, injecting that into a cell. And my guest tonight, Barret, explaining to us that he actually changed the species within this cell. And then that cell began to replicate. And there are those in the media that are saying that this man and his team created life, and saying that this is a victory for materialism, and therefore the atheists are going to be able to use this as proof that it doesn't take a god or some kind of a supernatural being to create life. So these are some of the things that we are talking about tonight, and we invite you to call and be a part of the program. If you have questions or comments in this regard, maybe there's some things that you have heard about some of these issues that you would like clarification. Well, Barret's a guy that can help us clarify these things. So this really isn't from your view and the view of a lot of others, and it would be mine as well, that it's not a creation of life. And yet there's something that I read, this quote, and here it is. And this is going at it from the other directions. And it says, until the host cell itself can be built artificially from scratch, it cannot be said that life has been created. And so, something in the things that you had me read, there's this discussion about a bottom-up.
Correct.
And a top-down.
Yes.
And I think what that is talking about is even here in this question, that until somebody can start right from the beginning and create that cell,
correct,
then give it a DNA and it begins to grow. But what we're talking about here, what Ventnor and his team did, was more of a top-down approach, taking an existing cell and just changing what's going on within it.
The best analogy I think that we have is that rather than creating anything, what he's done is that he's transplanted the genome of the cell, which...
And again, the genome, for
the DNA.
The simple-minded folks like me,
DNA,
we can just say the DNA.
Which makes up, maybe in this case, about 1% of the cell.
Mm-hmm.
So 1% of the cell has been altered, but it does alter the characteristics of the cell, and so the cell has been, it is a new species.
Mm-hmm. Something, how significant is this discovery right now? And here's an illustration that I would use, again, something that I just came across the other day. It says it'd be like Ben Franklin discovering electricity with a kite string, and hundreds of years later we come up with a cell phone.
Right.
And saying that Ventnor's discovery, his accomplishment, is such a small step down this path that we could be generations away before anything significant comes of this. Would you agree? Help us put this into perspective.
Well, I think that there are far more questions than answers. And there's very few answers at this point, and this discovery is barely a month old. So there's a number of things that we don't know, and there's certain aspects of the technique that, in fact, Dr. Ventnor wants to patent, and so they have not been made public. And the whole issue of the public aspect of this discovery is a significant one. The ability to take a synthetic genome, put it into a cell, and it functions is significant. And the way that we have had to work with DNA in the past, this basically creates an efficiency that could be significant from a technical standpoint. So we've dealt with some really very difficult problems, such as the H1N1 virus, and creating a vaccine for that. And given the tools that we currently had, in some ways it was almost 9 months before we had a viable vaccine. using these techniques, the potential is that we could have a vaccine within days versus months.
Okay. I want you
So
to
the efficiency of this technologically could be significant.
Okay. Well, we'll come back to that in just a minute. We do have a caller, Dale from Portland. Are you there, Dale? Told we had Dale from Portland.
Hey, Merritt, this is Dale.
Dale.
Welcome to the program, Dale. Go ahead.
Well, I'm sorry, Merritt, that I wasn't able to get on and watch your program earlier. So I'm not really informed on the subject very well. But I am a bit of an apocalyptic person. But I've kind of have given up my fear of nuclear apocalypse.
Mm-hmm.
I found it interesting that Obama likened the oil spill in the Gulf to a virus of sorts, a viral environmental disaster.
Yes. And he did call a task force to, put together their view of this and the potential for bioterror.
And that's something that we're going to be talking about in just a minute in that regard. Did you have another comment, Dale?
Well, it just occurred to me that if, and there's a little bit of a delay here in watching the program and listening. Maybe I should leave the room here.
Yeah.
But are you thinking that of scientists creating living monsters?
Yeah, we're going to be talking about the ramifications next. So why don't you just keep listening? That's exactly what we want to talk about next. So that's a real good segue. I appreciate you calling with that comment. Let's talk about that a little bit. You already have talked about it a little bit. The question that I asked was, is this discovery going to lead to anything anytime soon? And then you said you started talking about the possibility down the road of being able to create a vaccine for an H1N1 just in days or weeks as opposed to months or
Right.
whatever it is. So I'll ask the same question again, and maybe a two-part question. Number one is, what are some of the positive things? For instance, Dale talked about this oil spill,
Right.
and then you talked about an H1N1 vaccine. So talk a little bit about the positive potential, but I still have the question, how far are we away from even having anything like that being feasible from this early discovery or this early accomplishment?
Well, technologically, there's a number of things that are a barrier that we don't know. One of the things when you create a new species like this of bacteria, whether or not these species will trade genes, mutate, et cetera, is something that's totally unknown at this point. And so what the bacteria could mutate to and become pathogenic and be problematic is definitely a significant concern, and immediately regulations are going to have to be put in place with respect to how this research is done.
So let me just repeat what you're saying there, is that as this research begins and starts down this path, and I'm assuming it will continue, that the scientists, the researchers, may have a certain goal in mind, but that doesn't necessarily mean that they're not going to have something happen in the middle, that this is going to take off on its own and go in a different direction.
That's correct.
Okay, so that's something, and that's where you talk about they're going to have to watch it closely and make sure that there are some...
I think informed scientists, when they talked about this, that's one of the first things that they talked about.
Yeah.
And I think that that's one of the things that has to be really closely watched and understood. The other thing is that this research is extremely expensive. Mm-hmm. I mean, right now the cost is dropping, but still per base pair, is about $1. So this DNA, just the cost of it was about $1 million.
Yeah, he found 1 million of them.
And overall, this overall project cost about $40 million to complete. So it's very expensive.
Just this little tiny step that he took was $40 million.
That's correct. So there are significant issues with respect to it, and that brings in the whole need for investment for the commercialization,
so just,
patents,
you know,
et cetera.
sounding like all of this, I come back to that question again. We could possibly be generations away, even in a straight line, to go from where we are now to an H1N1 vaccine, or to be able to do that, even if there's no problems along the way, it could take a generation or two.
Well, with the way that we are sequencing genomes and building blocks that basically that we can arrange to create synthetic genomes to put in cells, MIT today has about 2,500 genome blocks that can possibly be used in this way.
Genome means DNA.
Yeah, but the problem is that we don't know what they're doing.
Right.
And as you put these together, what the effect is and how they're going to behave is not anything that we have any ability to know and predict about it. And it's another thing that the scientists that have commented on this have pointed out. And I think, you know, it's similar to the situation that we had when we were investigating atomic energy. And, you know, Richard Feynman talks about walking down one of the hallways in Los Alamos, and there was a stack of uranium blocks, and if somebody would have hit those, they could have started a chain reaction. And in those days, we didn't understand what the potential was, and I think we're dealing with much the same with respect to these genome blocks and building blocks that we currently have.
So again, let's just make it real practical. Let's say that there is success, whether it's in 5 years, 10 years, 50 years, or 100 years. The potential would be to be able to put together antidotes to viruses very quickly, to be able to treat disease. We're talking about this oil slick that with this technology down the road, when they know what they're doing, there would be the possibility of creating an organism that would go out there and eat up all the oil. So we're looking at a lot of very possible positive things that could happen in the scientific industry. And I'm talking about just a straight line, no problems, and so forth.
Correct.
What about the negative side? You know, Dale said, are you talking about, creating a monster or something like that? What are some of the negative ramifications, some of the things that may concern us or just the world in general?
Well, I think we have some of the same concerns that we've had all along with respect to genetic engineering and what something can do, you know, that's problematic. And being aware of what is not necessarily a problem in one environment can end up being a significant problem in another environment. There was an incident many years ago where a altered bacteria, an altered organism was created, and its virulence wasn't really understood or appreciated. In those days, there was really no way of or necessity for disposing of biohazards, and it was simply thrown out the window of a university lab. Well, that bacteria infected every elm tree and killed every elm tree in the campus, and it was totally unpredictable and unknown. And those are the kind of things that are very problematic that probably we don't know enough to be able to predict, and we have to have regulations and things in place to be able to test and understand if the bacteria is going to mutate, as it exchanges genes, what those gene combinations are going to do, and how problematic it is.
So there's one potential negative, as we've been talking about, that a mutation, that this experiment gone berserk could turn into something very damaging for our own environment. But what about the potential of, saying, a rogue state having some pretty smart scientists and coming up with a virus, say a biological weapon, that has no antidote?
Well, this is not a virus.
Okay,
It really doesn't have anything to do with viral research per se. The issue for bioterrorism, like they could put in something that's a known toxic protein to make lots of it in a cell, yes. The cost of it's kind of prohibitive at this point.
So the biggest,
it's really the unknown and the unpredictability.
So and you've come back to that several times. So it's really getting from here to there, and all the wrong things that could happen in the middle that is probably the biggest concern then.
Yes.
As opposed to somebody out there that wants to get us saying, hey, this is a good way to create a weapon that'll get rid of all those guys.
And in this case, I think that Craig Ventnor was a bit cavalier because he inserted DNA with his signature and other kinds of things. That DNA could very well have a function. Maybe it doesn't have a known function now, but if it mutates or it rearranges, and bacteria exchange genes more so than stocks, on a trading floor. Mm-hmm. And so how that bacteria exchanges genes and what it mutates to, and what that aberrant DNA that he added actually does, becomes an interesting question. I'm
going to switch gears here a little bit, and we are discussing tonight the question, can man create life? And if you're just now tuning in, or you've been listening for a couple of minutes, a scientist, our group of scientists, created a synthetic DNA, which is all the genetic information that's inside a cell, and created it with 4 chemicals and a computer program injected into the cell, and that cell came to life. Just generally, that's what's happened. We're asking the question, did those scientists create life? And our conclusion is no, not really. Maybe manipulated life or changed life or manipulated DNA. But was it really a creation of life? Probably not. But what I want to talk about a little bit now as we start wrapping up the program is the possibility that, like in the media reports that we cited at the beginning of the program, man created life and new organisms, and this is a victory for materialism, and atheists now have ammunition to say that God is not needed to create life. Do you think behind all of this, I do, that there is a little bit of an agenda there to try to push forward a worldview that leaves God out? Do you think there's any of that there? I personally do. What do you think?
Well, of the 8 responses in nature, 7 said no. This has no philosophical bearing whatsoever.
And again, just for people who are just now tuning in, Nature is a magazine.
Yeah, leading scientific publication. And I think most scientists, and almost without exception, said, no, this doesn't have any of those implications. Because this is really not bottom-up creation of life.
So they even recognize this?
Absolutely. Because there's a lot of things in this that have been done for a long time.
And so the media that's saying creation of life and the headlines and all that, you think it's more to sell newspapers than to push an agenda?
Yes.
Okay. So do you think that the atheists or the materialists will see this and try to run with it, even though
the only person that has been Arthur Caplan, and he's been pretty much criticized by every single scientist, of significance with respect to this. Even Ventnor himself, is clear that there is no philosophical issue here other than really the technological side and so forth. But this is very much a commercial technological event, not a philosophical, not a paradigm-changing event from the standpoint of science.
Let's talk a little bit about the term life, because the media is saying life is created. We just discussed that. We don't need to discuss that anymore. But I went to look for a definition of life on the internet, and it's interesting that most of the, all the definitions that I came across on the internet, and I just did a quick search on meaning of life, the word life. They were all philosophical and scientific, and there was no really good answer to what is life and what is not life. So when we ask the question, did these guys create life? If nobody can define it, how do we know if he did or didn't?
Well, I think that there's some very specific requirements for life that separate complex molecules such as proteins and even viruses. Viruses are not considered living. And the reason viruses are not considered living is, one, they cannot replicate outside of a host, and they cannot repair themselves. And so replication and repair are both necessary for life. So one of the things that established this new species was its ability to replicate. Now, whether it has an ability to repair or not, and actually some of the things that Ventnor had to do to get it to replicate and to accept a foreign DNA were problematic. So he had to knock out the cell's own system that would see that DNA as foreign and destroy it.
Okay, we do have another caller. We have Barret from Portland. Barret, welcome to Answers for a Thirsty World.
Yes, hi. I just want to say the media is pretty much for corporations and propaganda and to mislead people pretty much, I believe. And I believe the reason that they want to say that they've created life is because you have corporations like Monsanto's who are genetically vandalizing the Earth's genetic makeup, basically. They're vandalizing it. You know, because all cells have protections, so one species can't interbreed with another, but they're able, through using viruses, to breach that. So you can take spider genes and put it into a tomato and make it last longer, and so you can transport it 1,400 miles and waste all that energy doing that when people are at the same time not being educated on how to make their own food, create their own food and stuff, so we can be sustainable and have solar panels. And there's so much problems with the media. I'm just saying that the reason they're trying to shut this up, that we've created life. No, what they want to do is they want to tax it, because if Monsanto's seed ends up in another farmer's field, they can sue you and take your field and say you stole it, and then your property becomes theirs. It's just corruption. They say they've created life. Life creates life.
Do you think that, just a question, Barret, do you think that man, any time in the future, will be able to create life?
You mean like out of computer chips and maybe some biological stuff?
Well, we're whatever you would define as life.
Well, they say that the Bilderbergs, the Skull and Bones, these elites that work behind the curtains, and then they make it look like the president's running things, but they're really just a front man.
So
your question was again? Yes.
Do you think that man will ever in the future be able to create life?
It's the elite's goal to do that.
Do you think they will ever be able to?
In the sense that you can't create something that's already existed for infinity, as far as I'm concerned.
All right. Thank you for calling.
Thanks.
So, that was Barret. I think that was a very interesting answer to that question, because he's talking about something existing for infinity. Any comments on?
Well, I mean, his whole point was that, this is all about commercialization. And it's one of the big things that is at issue here, because Ventnor has submitted 14 patents with respect to this technique and the things that he's done, and it still is not clear how he got the cell to we have a pretty good idea, but still the specifics are not clear. And the interesting thing is that it may have worked for this cell, but will this be a technique that will work in general for other cells? And that remains to be seen. He is by no means the only person working on that. There are lots and lots of people that are working in this arena, but he is very clever, and he's got a lot of good people and experience behind him.
On a philosophical level, maybe even on a spiritual level, perhaps, we're talking about the meaning of life. What about intelligence from a scientific standpoint? I would even say from a materialistic standpoint. How does the materialist, do you know how the materialist explains intelligence?
Well,
and here's my point. Here's my point, is that somebody, whether it's Ventnor or anyone else that comes up with such an amazing discovery accomplishment as he did, and people may want to say that it's a victory for materialism. Aren't they forgetting that behind this accomplishment was a certain amount of intelligence? And how do you explain intelligence from a strictly materialistic standpoint? In other words, can something that's strictly material create something else that's just strictly material? Yeah, you understand what I'm saying?
I understand what you're saying. I find this whole situation interesting because the media has kind of missed some of the comedic irony that goes along with this.
Help us understand that.
Because in a sense, what you have is an artificial species that requires an intelligent designer. This species couldn't have happened without Ventnor designing and putting these things together. It didn't happen by probability and chance. It was specifically designed. So here is an example of a species that is created not by chance, but by a designer, which I find pretty ironic with respect to the overall implications of what it really means, and the whole idea that life has, quote, been created when clearly it has not. But what really has been done is that you have a new species that was created by a designer.
And so we come back to that idea again that there wasn't a designer behind this. See, when I started thinking of some of these things, and we start talking about the fact that and when we talk about materialists, we're talking about those who may believe that we are nothing but chemical reactions. That's all we are, is just matter and chemical reactions. Mm-hmm. And then trying to explain how the mind fits into that, how intelligence fits into that. I even heard somebody make the comment that when you look at a mother loving their child, trying to explain that from a chemical reaction is kind of hard to do when you look at the emotional makeup of a human being. And yet the materialist is required to say all of this is just simply matter and chemical reactions. Is that what materialism is really all about?
Materialism can basically explain the chemical reactions, the electrical activity that goes on in the central nervous system. How you define intelligence gets to be an interesting discussion. But where the materialist falls off completely is explaining consciousness. And the whole aspect of consciousness is an area that science has no explanation whatsoever about. And the materialists will say that as soon as you have a complex enough nervous system, that simply those interactions are going to produce consciousness. But there really is no material basis or no understanding of consciousness whatsoever. So that's where the materialist fails. And there is no explanation for consciousness. Why you and I should have language and be conscious, evolution has no answer for. Because it shouldn't be, and it's not required by anything that goes along with those kinds of requirements.
Barret is back with us again. Barret has another question or comment. Welcome back, Barret.
Yeah, I just had a comment. It's not man creating life. It's man creating the illusion of man creating life. He's creating greed, a way to feed greed, basically. They're trying to patent life, like they're trying to patent, everything that we create. They've patented. They want to patent and privatize water, and they've privatized oil, and they want to unite this new world order so that it's one big, huge monopoly, so that we're all serving the state, whether it be a government or your local state or government or whatever. But
let me ask you.
I think it's material. The problem is materialism, growth, and technology. It's separating us from the natural world and from whatever spiritual beliefs that we may have.
So where, in your mind, and you've been good to call and interact with us, where did life come from? Do you see that there was a creator?
I don't think there is a creator. I'm kind of along the lines of Carl Sagan back in 1980 when I was a freshman in high school. When Cosmos was out, he said that life is simply, there's a little kid that says, "What is the Milky Way?" Carl Sagan says, "You are the Milky Way. The Earth is the Milky Way. You don't need a telescope to see the Milky Way. When you hear my voice, it's the Milky Way." He also said that life is the universe's way of seeing and experiencing its own reality, its own existence, because it's alone. And that's what the people who believe in Buddhism believe in, that Buddha is here. Everything is that. That's the only thing that's ever existed, exists now, and ever will exist.
Where did you probably know more about Sagan than I do. Where does he say the Milky Way came from, or where you came from?
Star stuff.
And where did that? Why did that come from?
Topical. You can't create something out of the uncreated, the unborn, the undying.
So who created where did the original matter come from in your mind?
It's always been here, ever changing. It's like
so matter. You would say matter.
Different.
You would say matter is eternal.
Yeah, I would say that reality is simply, it's a never-ending meeting of matter and some intelligence, some less intelligence, some materialistic, some non-materialistic. So there's the animal world. If you've ever had a pet, if you listen to your pet, you'll have. Now, this may sound like a nutcase.
Yeah, just about one more minute, and then we've got to wrap this up.
If you ever go out in the woods and listen and just sit quietly out there and appreciate things and not see dollars in the trees, it's like where our trees are, the ocean's being polluted, and they don't care. They don't care. They're trying to hijack the chemistry of the earth, by saying they created, okay. Monsanto created this super seed, and they're also
quickly, please.
Taking the nutrients out of our food by doing this genetic mixing.
Okay.
They're making us sick too.
I appreciate that. We need
Anyway, that's all.
Thank you, Barret. Real interesting that he thought that matter was eternal, that these things go on.
That is a Buddhist belief. I mean, one of the issues that Buddhists has with modern science is that there is no beginning, where science clearly points to a beginning. That is something that is.
Thank you, Barret, for calling. I think that helped us kind of frame some of the things that we wanted to talk about tonight. And we were talking about life, and I was thinking today about what the Bible says about life and the creation of life. And in Genesis chapter 2, it says that God took the dirt and he formed man, and he breathed into him the breath of life, and he became a living soul. And so for those of us who believe that the Bible is the Word of God and that it does have an explanation of how things got started, it says that God created man from the dirt. And I like a little story, and this is something that you may think about. I offer this to those of you who are watching us tonight, is man came along and said to God, and this is this could be something that might be taking place today, at least symbolically, is that man said, "Watch this, God. I'm going to create man," and man says to God, "I'm going to begin with some dirt. Watch this," and he picks up some dirt, and God looks at the one who says, "I'm going to create life," and God says to him, "Get your own dirt." See, the point is that when you start going back, and whether it's this accomplishment by Ventnor, he started with an existing cell.
Correct.
So he did, and if you use the term from the ground up, for man to create life, he's going to have to create the cell.
Yes.
And so the question is, where did the cell come from? When it comes to any of this, where did the matter come from? And as we were talking to Barret, and he said Carl Sagan was talking about the Milky Way, and you are the Milky Way. And then we asked, well, where did the Milky Way come from? Where did you come from? It came from matter. Where did the matter come from? And they have to say it's always been here. Otherwise, they have to acknowledge that there is an eternal being behind all of it. We call it an intelligent designer, or God, the creator. And we believe that that's exactly what all of this is about, is that man is incapable of creating life. Man will never be able to create life. He can create synthetic organisms. He can create synthetic DNA. He can manipulate DNA, but man will never be able to create life from the ground up. Only God can do that. And God, our Creator, wants to have a personal relationship with us. That's part of the reason that He created us, that we would have a personal relationship with Him and acknowledge Him as God, acknowledge Him as the Creator, to glorify Him. But the Bible says that all of us have fallen short of His glory and His holiness. We've chosen to go our own independent way. But God solved that problem also, because a little over 2,000 years ago, He sent Jesus Christ to die on the cross for our sin, to pay a penalty for our unholiness, and then by giving us an opportunity to confess Jesus as our Savior, as our Lord, and to give us an opportunity to know God personally. And so that really is our invitation to you tonight, as we've been talking about whether man can create life or not. It's our belief, our strong belief and conviction, that man will never be able to create life. Only God can do that. And that God has created you, He has created me and Barret in His own image, and He wants to have a relationship with you. God is a holy God. God, and we are all sinful creatures, and we are unable to know God on our own, but Jesus Christ died on the cross for us. He paid the penalty of the sin for our sin. And by simply acknowledging that in a prayer, back in 1968, I prayed a simple prayer that just said, Jesus, I know that I'm separated from you. God, I know I'm separated from you, and Jesus died for my sin. Please forgive my sin, come into my life, and make me the kind of person that you want me to be. And that is what you need to do tonight, if you'd like to have that kind of relationship. So thank you for tuning in, and Barret, thank you for being with us tonight.